Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Paleocrat Diaries. I'm your host, Jake Fowler, here with a very special guest. This is Canon 211, where we have special guests, such as my new friend, Dr. Ryan M. Brown. Dr. Brown, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
This is a real treat for me, and I think our audience is going to enjoy this too, because we have some philosophy for once, right? This show is normally theology and history and a little bit of spirituality, sometimes, not very often, but almost never philosophy. And so this is a unique opportunity for us to come together to talk about the virtue of hope and reason as we find it in Plato, and Joseph Pieper, and honestly in some of their detractors as well. So we'll get into that in just a moment. Before I do, I want to remind you all that Canon 211 is this new thing that I'm trying out, right? I'm starting it up. Here's the goal. I want to evangelize. I want to evangelize more so than I already have been, which wasn't very much, to be honest. I want to bring the message of Christ in creative ways to audiences who appreciate hearing about theology and history and philosophy and so on and so on and so on. So I've styled this series after the code of canon law 211 that indicates that the lay faithful have not only the right, but in fact the duty to spread the gospel of Christ. One of the ways that I think is important to do that is to bring attention to young scholars such as Ryan here, who write in the journal Communio, who write in Nova et Vetera, who write in forthcoming, actually it's not forthcoming any longer, the New Ressourcement, that is now being published. Gentlemen who write in The Thomist, and who write for Church Life Journal, and who write books like my friend Richard Decloux, who just wrote his first book, The Mind of Benedict XVI. That's what we're doing here at Canon 211. You can find exclusive Canon 211 content on Locals. That's canon211.locals.com. I encourage you all to become a member, and if you're so inclined, become a supporter as well. Now, Mr. Brown, Dr. Brown. Ryan Brown was a professor of philosophy. He has taught at Villanova University. He has taught at Sacred Heart University and Eastern University, but he's a family man through and through. He loves his wife, he loves his child, and he is pursuing a career in the tech industry because he has good sense, right? I say that tongue in cheek, but seriously, academia is not friendly for family life. I know that firsthand, and I only teach at a high school. Right? I'm blessed to teach at the school I teach at, and the administration loves families and they're very supportive. However, we're the exception that proves the rule. There are many, many professors out there who will be very frank if you ask them, and no, this is not a job for a family man. So with that being said, welcome once more to Canon 211, Paleocrat Diaries. Let's talk about your article.
Okay, where do you want to begin?
Well, I'd like to know what motivated you to write it in the first place, because we were talking before we started recording here, and it's fascinating. And how does somebody come up with, I think I'm going to write about Plato and Pieper?
Yeah, so a lot of my favorite things that I've thought through, research, written about, come about very happenstance out of my teaching. In this case, this really started when I was teaching at Eastern. When I was teaching there, I was teaching a class on ancient philosophy. I'm primarily a Plato scholar by trade, so that's kind of my bread and butter. But I was also teaching a philosophy religion class and trying to find resources that are accessible to audiences, freshmen, sophomores who haven't really done much philosophical work. Joseph Pieper, I think, he's not exactly easy, but compared to a lot of other philosophy, he's not nearly as abstruse, and he has really good sensibilities. So when I was teaching philosophy of religion, I decided to use some of his work, both in my philosophy of religion class, my intro class for my Eastern students, and just reading Plato and reading Pieper at the same time, started thinking like, huh, they're kind of doing something the same. In different ways, though. So Pieper is all but saying my thesis. He doesn't ever quite say it, but he really lays the grounds for it. And Plato, by contrast, doesn't say it at all, but he dramatizes it in the way that he portrays Socrates' life and action. He shows that what it is to be a Socratic philosopher is to be hopeful. So having those two things at the same time, I thought, let's see where this goes.
So that's your general thesis, is that human reason
Mhm.
is structured according to the virtue of hope. Am I
Yes.
phrasing that in an
Mhm.
acceptable way?
Yeah.
So you could say, and this is my summary of what I think you're writing about. So correct me if I'm wrong. You could you say that not only in Plato but in Pieper we find an account of human reason that at one and the same time is full of promise, but
Mhm.
also needs a ton of help.
Mhm.
So how do we find, like, what does it mean for reason to be hopeful in the first place? When you say that, what are you getting at?
Yeah, that's an important thing to clarify up front, especially because uh, hope is an ambiguous term. If you look at ancient Greek sources, when they use the word hope, the Greek word is elpis. They often have a very ambiguous idea, and it often is much more negative than what we hear when we look at Christian sources. For Christian sources, hope is a virtue. For the Greeks, hope might be a danger in general. So if you look at the classical expression of this, would be the myth of Pandora's box, where Pandora has been given all the gifts. She opens up the box, everything comes out, all these monsters, all these nasty things, and at the very bottom, she finds hope. And the Greeks don't know, is that a good thing or is that just the worst of the worst things, right? And you can kind of see why they would be ambiguous about it. It's the promise of some kind of salvation or fulfillment from all those monsters and nasty things, or it's a false promise that makes you think that you're going to get out of this, and really you're
Mm,
just tricking yourself into a worse version. And so we don't know. Is it good? Is it bad? What is it? The Greeks are ambiguous. But I think the way to start that kind of conversation is, let's start with the Christian working out of that idea, and then see if it has sources back in the Greeks. Before saying what the Christian concept is, I want to pause and give a little bit of a methodological remark about why I wanted to do this way.
sure.
I take from Thomas Aquinas very seriously his axiom that grace presupposes nature and then elevates it and perfects it.
Mm,
This is something that in Catholic thought uh, is fundamental, and that is not necessarily shared in other sects, other interpretations of Christianity or other religious traditions. But for Aquinas, he really nails this down, and it's endemic to the Catholic way of thinking. Uh, Grace doesn't wipe out nature. It doesn't replace it. It doesn't provide something wholly new. It takes something that's already good and it makes it better, but in a surprising way, in a way that nature itself couldn't presuppose, couldn't know what's going to happen. So, with that in mind, anything that we see as supernatural perfection must have a natural root. So, there has to be something in human nature that we can learn about without reference to revelation that tells us something about why hope is good, if that's something that is virtuous and thus a completion of what it is to be human. So with
okay.
that in mind, or if you want to jump in for a question, then we can, follow up.
No, no, please
Okay.
continue.
So with that in mind, just the Christian conception of hope that develops over the ancient into the medieval period. Um, Brief detour to Aristotle. Anyone who's taken a philosophy course and learned Aristotle's ethics this should sound familiar, but for Aristotle, the virtues of character that govern your actions, your feelings, they are, as he says, a mean condition between two extremes. So virtue is situated between a vice that corresponds to a deficiency of some sort and a vice that corresponds to an excess of some sort. So courage is between cowardice, too much fear, and rashness, too little fear, is a simple way to put it. When someone like Aquinas is going to spell out what he calls the theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, he still has that structure in his mind. And when he thinks of hope, he thinks of it as a middle condition between something deficient and something excessive. So if we think about what is hope between, it's between, on the one hand, despair, and on the other hand, presumption. So despair, things can't get any worse.
Mm-hmm.
Presumption, things can't get any better. We already have everything we need. Whereas hope charts a middle course that says, I anticipate some kind of fulfillment that I don't have, but I yearn for, and I suspect is possible, even if I have no idea how it's going to come about.
Mm. Okay. Okay. And in your article, you make a distinction between hope and reason being connected intrinsically
Mhm.
and extrinsically.
Mhm.
So for something to be connected extrinsically would almost be like to say that it's accidental,
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be so. It
Right.
just happens to be so.
Right.
You're saying that's not the case. In
Yeah.
your article, you claim that it's intrinsic. So can you unpack? Well, first of all, can you give us the opposing views concerning reason and hope being related
Mhm.
extrinsically, and
Yeah.
then maybe come back around to why you think that's not the case?
Yeah. So extrinsic relationships, as you said, they're kind of accidental happenstance. They happen to be connected. They could be split apart if you want. So the way I was thinking about this is I can have reasons to hope for something. I can be hopeful that reason will get the job done. Um, but in those cases, I already am kind of looking at one thing from the inside and then trying to kind of branch on to something else. And if I could be hopeful about reason's prospects, I could also be unhopeful about reason's prospects. If I could have a rational hope, I could also have an irrational hope. And that's both of those things are certainly true. We can do that. By contrast, what I mean by intrinsic is to say that when we are reasoning and hoping rightly, they go hand in hand and they can't be severed, in fact, except by when we use reason poorly or when we hope in some kind of way that's not proper to our nature.
Awesome. So you give some examples of other thinkers,
Hmm.
right? Like oh, the names escape me. They were right on the tip of my tongue. Heidegger was
Hmm.
one. Who are the others? Remind me, please.
Camus, Hegel. Um,
Right.
yeah, so I kind of split those up into two camps. And
Okay.
broad brushstrokes, not trying to get into the details of any of these thinkers.
Sure.
They're all
Sure.
much more interesting than I'm making them to be, but just to get the big picture. Um, these people I'm talking about are people who are thinking about that question on the intrinsic level and are saying they are not only intrinsically not connected, they're
Hmm.
intrinsically disconnected in some way. So that reason
Okay.
and hope never go together. They're always separate in some way. So the one camp we can call the Enlightenment rationalists. These are people like Rene Descartes and, in a different way, Georg Hegel. And this is a really common view that we see today in a lot of our contemporary people who kind of take a approach to science as if it's the be all end all and don't think through the kind of basic philosophical underpinnings of the sciences and think science is gonna answer all of our questions. So someone like
Hmm.
Stephen Hawking or Richard Dawkins, pretty common people you hear about a lot.
Hmm.
So this camp, the Enlightened rationalist camp, they say there's never any reason to hope because reason can get the job done. It is completely capable of understanding reality. It just needs time and effort.
So you don't need hope,
Mhm.
so if you have hope, then what? You're doubting reason. You don't have enough
Right.
faith in human reason to do what it can do.
Yeah, although I think they would even want to be skeptical of that language of faith in human reason, right? Because that's getting
Okay.
into the same network as hope. But they're going to say that reason is an instrument that is completely adequate to reality.
Hmm.
We might not have a complete understanding of reality yet, but that's just because we haven't had enough time. But if you give it time, it'll do itself. It's almost like reasoning is getting there no matter what. This train is unstoppable. That's kind of how Hegel seems to think about it when he's talking about the journey of consciousness to what he calls absolute knowing. We just need the time. So there's no reason to hope for understanding, because understanding is available to us.
Gotcha. So the thinkers like Heidegger and Camus,
Hmm.
on the other hand,
Yep.
they would say that you shouldn't have hope because why?
Yeah, so they take the opposite direction, where they say um, reason can't get the job done in
Okay.
principle. So hoping after it would be to try to treat reason like something it isn't, and would be to kind of impute this kind of magical fairy tale thinking. So Camus is very clear about this. He says we must forget how to hope. Actually,
Hmm.
to hope is to betray what reason has told us, and what reason has told us is we want to understand the world, and the world is not giving it to us, and never will.
And Heidegger seems to say that if you start hoping, then you're going to leap to answers, but you
Yeah,
want to
that's
remain in the questioning of
mhm,
philosophy.
right.
That part of your paper sort of stuck out to me as antithetical to philosophy. Like I always thought that philosophy was in pursuit of the answer,
Mhm,
and not averse to said answer.
mhm,
Like
mhm,
Heidegger, if I'm understanding this correctly, Heidegger seems to say that once you are in possession of an answer to a philosophical question, then you stop questioning,
mhm,
and therefore you stop being philosophical. So, in
mhm,
other words, if we hope and we receive, uh, some sort of dogmatic assurance, then we're actually being unreasonable because we've stopped seeking. Is that
mhm,
an accurate way to explain Heidegger? I mean, generally,
mhm.
again, avoiding
I
the
mean, as far as I can understand Heidegger, that sounds
sure.
right to me. I
Okay.
do not trust me to give you a proper Heideggerian analysis.
Fair
That's not
enough.
my
Fair
wheelhouse.
enough.
I wish it were, but well, maybe I'll just shamelessly plug for a moment. You're probably familiar with DC Schindler, who also is in that same
Yes.
volume. He has he's one of my mentors, and he's structured my thinking a lot. But in one of his books called The Catholicity of Reason, he has a
Mhm.
chapter on Heidegger and Dionysius the Areopagite, the 6th century mysterious Christian Platonist figure who's really cool, and we don't know anything about him other than he wrote some really interesting books. But he has a chapter on Heidegger and Dionysius that addresses that question very specifically. So if anyone's interested, I'd highly recommend it. But yeah,
So
so the short version. Oh, sorry.
the name of the text one more time. The
It's
Catholicity of Reason.
yes, that's the
Is
book.
that it? Who publishes that?
Uh, Erdman's, I want to say, if I'm
Okay,
remembering correctly.
excellent. I'll try to find that and put either the title and the publisher or a link
Mhm.
to it in
Yeah.
the show notes, the description below.
Yeah. Highly worth
Anyway,
reading.
I didn't.
Not easy stuff, but worth puzzling through.
Schindler is not easy.
Yeah.
I started reading his volume "Freedom from Reality."
Mhm.
I realized that I do not have the bandwidth to devote to that. I lent it to a friend.
Yeah.
He gave it a shot. He's like, "Yeah, I can't do this."
No,
So
it's tough.
you need to. It's a career. It's like a part
Mhm,
time job
mhm.
to read
Yeah.
Schindler.
Yeah.
But you were starting to say something. I interrupted you.
Mm. Yeah, so just what you said, your kind of gloss on what Heidegger is saying, I think that sounds accurate. That oh, by the way, we're getting joined by my cat. Say hello.
Oh,
This is
hello.
Boethius, named after the ancient Roman
Very
philosopher.
nice. Very
Um,
nice. Well, I'll drink to that. Hello, Boethius.
so he likes to join in whenever I'm on Zoom calls. I don't know why, but anyway, so yeah, your gloss on Heidegger I think is accurate as far as I understand Heidegger. But what he wants to do is he wants to absolutize questioning. That the philosophical act is questioning, not
Mhm.
answers. And I think his reason for that, as far as I can understand, is that reality has a kind of essentially mysterious character to it. So to try to pin it down in any kind of circumscribed way with an answer would be to do some kind of violence to reality. So there's actually a really good impulse behind that, which is I want to treat reality rightly. I want to treat it for what it is. But what I
Yeah.
think it is something that is not amenable to answers. And he's not wrong about that, I don't think.
Yeah.
It's just
No, that actually
Yeah.
That sounds really Catholic. I mean, in a
Mhm.
certain sense, like
Yeah.
the transcendence of reality compared to the human mind. Like
Mhm.
even though our universe is finite, we'll never plumb the depths of it,
Mhm.
whether scientifically or otherwise. So that does seem to hold some weight
Mhm.
on the one hand. However, so this sort of reminds me of we have discussions about formulations of dogma and can a dogma evolve or change in a
Mhm.
way that is it's expressed better, it's deepened, has doctrine develops and things like that without losing the same meaning, the same sense, what the
Right.
church has declared this means, uh, but it can never be fully exhausted,
Mhm.
right? So we can say that Mary was immaculately conceived, and that's true, and so we
Mhm.
have an answer, right?
Mhm.
Contra Heidegger, but we can't ever truly exhaust that
Yeah.
aspect of reality. So Heidegger would, it'd be like 1-to-1. It's a draw kind of thing.
Mhm. And that's more or
Um,
less Pieper's response to Heidegger, is to say, you're absolutely right that reality is mysterious. You're absolutely right to try to respect that mystery, but
hmm,
you're missing something. Um, I think the two kinds of things that could be missing there that might help bridge that gap between the kind of Heideggerian sensibility for mystery and a Catholic sensibility for mystery is the first is the medieval notion of what's called the analogy of being, and which is to say that um, when we look at creatures, temporal finite things, and we look at God, they are distinct. They are not the same. God is not one of us. God's not like us. God doesn't have the same status as us, not the same kind of being as us. He's not a being among other beings. Uh, so far, so mysterious, right? Like he's completely other. But the flip side of that, the analogy side of that, is nevertheless there's somehow a relationship between what God is and what creaturely things are. So when I say, my cat is a good cat, and I say God is good, I don't mean good exactly the same, but nor do I mean that they're completely distinct predicates. Um, that's how the medievals try to pull that together without collapsing, and that's the thing that Heidegger seems to be allergic to me at least.
okay. I have a note in the margins. If you have the summer 2023 issue of Communio, that's where Dr. Brown's article can be found. And on page 385, I have written in the right hand margin regarding Camus. He claims, so I'm going to read a little bit and quote here. So rather than choosing Christ as a way to overcome the hopelessness of our experience, Camus claims instead that, quote, there is no fate that cannot be surmounted by scorn, end quote.
Mhm.
Any act of hope would thus prohibit reason from being truly itself and from responding to the absurd in the only way genuinely available to it. Only in rebellion against the absurd can reason truly remain reason. So I
Mhm.
have written down, if reason can only be reason when it despairs, that sounds a lot like Jean-Paul Sartre,
Mhm.
who claims that man's existence itself is absurd, and the sooner we
Mhm.
accept that, the sooner we can sort of move on.
Mhm.
Is Camus saying something similar to Sartre? It sounds very similar to me.
Oh, they were buds. They formulated these ideas in tandem together. They had their divergences throughout history and everything, but these guys are very much part of the same movement of early 20th century French existentialism. They both have, you know, scholars will nitpick about the differences between them, but I would say in broad brushstrokes, they're doing the same kind of project.
Yeah, it struck me as um, related to uh, the idea that we just need to embrace that existence doesn't make sense,
Hmm.
and sort of maybe you've seen or maybe you haven't seen. I'll tell you. I used to be a policeman, and some police officers wear sometimes bulletproof vests on the outside of their uniform shirt.
Hmm.
Right, I always wore one underneath because I thought it looked better, but some guys wore theirs on the outside. And sometimes you could put like Velcro patches
Hmm.
on your bulletproof vest, right? So I had a couple of patches. I had a St. Michael pray for us kind of thing. I had American flag, and this would have been under my shirt. Uh, there's one out there it's got a guy with a mustache and like aviator sunglasses on, and it says "Embrace the suck." And basically, what it means is like this career is horrible, and you just need to embrace that. So, in an analogous way,
Hmm.
it seems like that's what Sartre and Camus are saying. Like human existence, human reason are horrible, and none of this makes sense. And so despair is the name of the game, and it's absurd. And the sooner you can get behind that and just accept it, the
Hmm.
better off you'll be.
I want to modify that a little bit.
Okay.
So they accept that, or they propose that reality doesn't provide intelligibility. We want it; it's not going to give it to us. That's what Camus means by the absurd. But on the other hand, they have this deep intuition that nevertheless human life is worth living, and they're trying to
Hmm.
do this work to detach the value of human life from any kind of metaphysical background that would guarantee the value of it. So while they accept that reality is absurd, their project is trying to say, nevertheless, life is good, and we want to do it, and we need to think through what does it mean to live well without being able to rely on that kind of metaphysical background. So when you look at someone like Camus, he's going to say very directly, there is no substitution for 20 or years of life, right? Like life is good. We want to keep doing it. We can't call it good
Hmm.
with the, Platonic capital G, but because we don't have that metaphysics available to us. But we recognize that existence is worthwhile, and we want to live it well, whatever that means.
Okay. Well, that's helpful. Thank you for that correction. It's also good for my humility. Um, all right. So on the next page,
Mhm.
actually, I want to ask you, what does Pieper have to say about that? About despair on the one
Mhm.
hand, vis-a-vis Heidegger and Camus, and presumption,
Mhm.
like we find with Descartes and those who you just mentioned Hegel before.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
Descartes and Hegel would kind of fall on the presumption side of the
Mhm.
vice here, and then Heidegger and Camus on the despair side. Pieper finds himself in the middle,
Mhm.
right? And Pieper would claim Plato as an ally, right?
Mhm.
So
I think so.
what do these two guys have to say to the others?
So what they think, by contrast to the others, is that our experience of being finite beings in time cannot be understood except by reference to some kind of ultimate fulfillment that is in some way genuinely possible for us, even if we don't understand how it's possible for us. So the Hegel and the Descartes view of this is that genuine fulfillment, we can make it happen on our own. We don't need any help. We got the tools. We're just going to get moving. It might take a little bit, who knows, but we're getting there. And if you look at Descartes, he's very upfront about this. He thinks that there can be a universal learning, and then we'll have all the sciences, and then we'll be able to do medicine and technology, and our lives will be easier. And we could talk. Hobbes, his contemporary, who has a similar kind of project, uses this phrase "commodious living." Like that's the goal. We're going to have commodious lives. We're going to have all the commodities that make our lives easy. That sounds pretty nice, um, but from their perspective, that's it. Hegel has a much more interesting version of that. And I don't want to be antagonistic to Hegel or even Descartes. I think they both got lots of good stuff to offer us. But in broad brushstrokes, they think they set the bar too low because they think that the fulfillment available to us is something we can accomplish on our own. The flip side, the Heidegger Camus model is we yearn for that fulfillment, but it's not real. Uh,
Hmm.
whether that's Camus saying reality won't give it to us, or whether that's Heidegger saying um, the nature of reality is such that we can't capture it in that way. Heidegger is maybe a little bit more open to some kind of possibility for a fulfillment. He's kind of cagey about this. He does say at some point, like, the reason why we can't do metaphysics in the classical way is because you can't dance before that, like you would dance before a god, and that's that opens onto something that could be, maybe there's some kind of connection to that bigger mystery that's fulfilling, but it's not a kind of final fulfillment. Whereas Pieper says the temporal finite life is always by nature directed to what he calls the status comprehensoris, the state of comprehensive good, final fulfillment. If you go back to Plato, we go to the Symposium, and see Diotima's speech about the nature of love. The nature of love is such that it always draws us beyond itself towards communion with the beautiful, beauty itself. We might not know what that is. We're trying to figure it out, but that's what we want. And if we love rightly, we can get there in a very meaningful way. So that fulfillment can happen.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. That was a really beautiful part of the paper, and so that would be section. Let's see, what section is that? Section 3 or 4. You come to this section where you're sort of breaking down in Plato's Symposium how the woman's name. How did you say it?
Diotima is what I would say. People say diatima, diotima. We don't know.
Okay,
one of those.
So she's like educating those present on what it means to be open to the good and the true and the beautiful, and so that. As far as I understand it, what she's saying, or what Plato is saying through this character of his, is that it's like a ladder, right? And you start on the lower rungs, and you're appreciating the goodness of physical creation, and then you can start to appreciate the goodness of some spiritual things, and then ultimately you end up with the good itself, right? Which Catholics would call God, right? This is like Aquinas's 5 proofs, and when you get to the end, you're like, and this all people call God. And so that's I put a little note on the side, and I just wrote God because I'm like, this lady, or Plato through this character again, is getting at the fact that when human love, in this case, out of its poverty, yet with like a driving force toward what it seeks, what it desires, it finally attains what it desires, then it can rest, right? So that this recalls like Augustine in his Confessions, and it reminds me of Von Balthasar, and so many people in between. And so I thought that was such a beautiful part of your paper. I really enjoyed reading that part. I want to go back though. I want to hop back just a little bit, because let's see, on page 386, you wrote, and so concerning both of these camps, the despair philosophers and the presumption philosophers, you wrote this. In both cases, then, we see a reason that refuses to be surprised by truth.
Right.
In a well-constructed plot of a play, for example, the resolution is one that simultaneously could not have been anticipated and yet perfectly fulfills the setup. In the margins of the paper, I wrote, this is like the incarnation regarding the messianic prophecies.
Yep.
So what I'm thinking with that is, you've got the Old Testament, and you've got God who wants to be in covenant with man, and he's revealing himself little by little over time, and almost nobody, in fact, I would say nobody, can see where this is going.
Right.
And then finally you have the incarnation and God's full revelation of himself in the person of Christ. And it's like, oh, this makes so much sense now. This is a fulfillment of all these prophecies in a way that far surpasses anything that we could have done before. So even in the midst of the glories of human reason, the rabbis were not fools. Like they had an understanding of God's revelation and the way God was unfolding his pedagogy through time and space. And yet precious few of them recognized the Son, when he
Right.
came. So that seems to be at least related in some way. What are your thoughts on that, Ryan?
I would say the incarnation is the quintessential ultimate version of the same idea. So maybe let's take it back a moment from the one of the most mysterious things that have ever happened, right, to something that's more mundane. When I wrote that, I have in mind what Aristotle says about Oedipus, the ancient Greek play,
Mhm.
that when you watch Oedipus, or you watch another tragedy, some kind of well constructed plot like that, there's all this anticipation, there's all this setup, there's all this moving parts, and you're following along, you understand what's going on, but you have no idea what's coming. And the moment the crux hits, and then Oedipus finds out that he actually killed his father, he's been sleeping with his mother, and then he blinds himself and all that. Spoiler alert in case any of you haven't seen read Oedipus. But it's you couldn't have expected it if you weren't already aware of the story. But when it happens, it takes all of those disparate pieces that have been set together and binds them into this perfect unity that makes sense of them in a way that you couldn't have anticipated, but you had an intimation that there was something that would pull it all together. I
Mm.
think good dramas do that. What I'm kind of convinced about is that truth itself works that way. It dramatically unfolds. It has a dramatic structure. This is again some of my influence by DC Schindler. He wrote his first book was on Balthazar and the dramatic structure of truth.
Mhm.
I won't claim to be an expert on any of that. I find it really interesting. I'm convinced by it, but I can't lay out the argument for you what he says about Balthazar. But I think that's intuitively true, that the event of truth, not just, is this a true proposition, but when you have that flash of insight, when you come to understand something important about the world, it unfolds as if a drama where you have the pieces, you understand what's going on, but then something clicks, you have the flash of insight, and then everything makes sense. If that's how truth works, then it's got to be true about the biggest of the truths, which would be the incarnation. In which case, as you were saying, the rabbis, they were not knuckleheads. They
Right.
were smart guys. They were deeply in tuned, as tuned as you can be, and yet the by and large, Israel did not know what the Messiah would look like. They thought the Messiah was going to be some great warrior liberator, and then you get this Jesus guy who looks nothing like that, right? And yet, retrospectively, fulfills the prophecies exactly in a way that maybe we couldn't have expected. But once we see it, it takes what we did have and elevates it into perfection.
Sure. Yeah,
Mhm.
man, that's awesome. Thank you for that
Mhm.
explanation. So let's get to the heart of it. We're almost 40 minutes in, and we're just now reaching section 2 out of 10. Right, if that's any indication where this is going. Um, the status viatoris,
Mhm.
right? This is Pieper's term for being on the way, and that's a reference to man on his pilgrimage, right here on earth. Um, we're visitors, right? We're journeying through. This is not our permanent home. Uh, Thinking about human reason and thinking about the virtue of hope. We've said what not to think, right?
Mhm.
Uh, what should we think? Like, can you offer a positive presentation of why me, my audience, why
Mhm.
should we think that reason is structured in a hopeful way?
So the gist of what I'm thinking is, it's abundantly clear we're finite temporal beings. We exist in time. We haven't lived our lives completely yet, but there is some kind of anticipation that there will be an end, whether that's natural death, or if you buy into religious claims, that'll be kind of elevation into supernatural life. The maximal version of that, you'll have the beatific vision where you'll finally see God as God for the first time, and it will no longer just be intimations that you can gather in creation or revelations and the content of revelation, but it'll be the real thing fully. Um, so what it is to be us is to be this thing that isn't what we are intended to be, but directed towards what it is, directed toward that fulfillment. And so my thought is, if that's what it is to be the kind of things we are, then whatever is most essential to us should follow that same structure. And so maybe it would help to think about, we're between fulfillment and lack. We have a lack, we're directed towards fulfillment, but we're not animals, right? We're not the non-reasoning animals who don't have an intimation of that possible fulfillment that they maybe can be brought into. Who knows what's going on with afterlife and animals, but um, they don't have the possibility for communion with the ultimate that we do. They have maybe some kind of instinctive, presence of the ultimate in them, but they can't relate to it in the way that we can. On the other hand, we're not angels. We don't have, all the knowledge already present to us at once. We're not always already in relationship with God in that way. We're always already in relationship with God in some way, in the relation of creation, but not in the relationship of, fraternity. That's something that develops as we progress towards that fulfillment. So if that's what it is to be us, to be between those kind of poles, then whatever is proper to us should look the same. When we go to Diotimus' account of love, that's exactly what we see. What it is to be the kind of thing that loves is to not have the thing you love and yet be directed toward the thing you love. If we follow the entire philosophical tradition, practically all of them say in one voice, which is pretty rare in philosophy. That's, get a bunch of philosophers together. When do they agree about anything? But they agree that most of them agree that whatever it is that we are is distinguished by being the kind of thing that has reason. Aristotle says we're the animal that has logos. We're the animal that has reason, speech, language. That word logos can be translated a bunch of different ways. But if that's what it is to be us, then reasoning has to have that same structure of being situated in this finite temporal way, directed towards some kind of completion or fulfillment that it doesn't have and yet yearns for. It intimates, it has some kind of presentiment of that, what that fulfillment might look like.
Mm-hmm.
And my suspicion is when reason remains itself, when reason is good reasoning, not bad reasoning, it always cleaves to whatever will bring it to that fulfillment, even if it doesn't know what that fulfillment might be. And when you put those that combination of two things together, that's hope. Presentiment of fulfillment, even if we don't know how it's going to come about.
So the ability then to accept the possibility of receiving truth
Mm-hmm.
from something other than our own reason.
Yep.
Is proper to our reason.
Yeah. And I would say the key word there is receiving.
Okay.
If you look back at those, one of the premises shared, I think, by both the despairing reasoners and the presumption reasoners is reason is active. Whereas in the hopeful reasoners, reasoning is active and receptive. There's something we do, but there's also something that we have to prepare ourselves for. And we're active in the reception. We're not, purely passive. We're not just wax that's getting stamped, but we're wax that wants to be stamped, and we can, make ourselves suitable for the stamping or not. So there's a kind of combination of activity and passivity, and what that word reception, I think, is the right word there. I would also, just add as a little note there that I would say that the most basic version is just being surprised by a truth that we might not have fathomed, wherever it comes from. That could be from another human being, and so purely natural. But it could also be divine, and that to be good reasoning, we can't foreclose the possibility of coming across something that surprises us.
Okay. I like that. So we've got maybe 15 minutes left. I want to be respectful of your time. Could you say some things about how you unpack this same phenomenon in the writings of Plato?
Mhm.
Right. So the next several sections of your paper are sort of devoted to, all right, now that we know what Pieper thinks, let me, this is Dr. Brown talking. Let me show you how we can find this in Plato to prove that what I'm saying is true. So please dazzle us with your intellect and explain, if you don't mind,
Mhm.
how does Plato echo the same things?
Right. Okay. Yeah. So, and I want to go back to Plato because I want to get a source that is prior to revelation, or at least prior to Christian revelation,
Okay.
uh, so that we have an unbiased audience to some extent. I mean, Plato has his own conception of the gods and all that, and
No, I think that's legitimate
yeah,
to show that it's not theological. Even
right.
it tends toward the theological,
Hmm.
but it's properly philosophical what you're doing, and I
Exactly.
appreciate that very much.
Yeah. So my idea then is, if we go back and we say we got the theological virtue of hope, it's situated between despair and presumption. Despair says I can't get what I want. Presumption says I already have it. Hope says I anticipate it. I don't know how it's coming, but I'm confident I'm going to get it in some way or another. God help me, right? Then what we see when we go into Plato is we have that structure of human nature that maps onto that in the account of love that we get in the Symposium. So love, which is just what it is to be human for Plato, we are the kind of thing we are based on how we love. If you love well, you'll become happy and good. If you love poorly, things will go bad. uh, to a Christian audience, that should sound pretty pretty accurate. It's basically Augustine on the hierarchy of desires. He gets that from Plato. No surprise there. What is to love is to be situated between fulfillment, which we yearn for, and lack. So we have the structure of human nature in that account of love that is the same structure that we get in Pieper's account that he's basing on Aquinas, more or less. So that's the first part of it. Then the second part is, okay, so Plato gave us the account of human nature. Does he actually tell us what's going on with reasoning? Why should we think reasoning has that structure or corresponds to that structure in some way? And he doesn't come out and say it. But what Plato does that is more or less unparalleled compared to any other author in all time is he dramatizes the life of reason. I'm pretty convinced by this idea that for Plato, you can't just say something; you have to say it and show it in a dramatic action.
Hmm.
And that's why he writes dialogues and he doesn't write treatises. Aristotle writes treatises, everybody else writes treatises, but Plato never wrote a treatise. He only wrote dialogues. He has to show philosophy in motion. So when we look at the motion of philosophy and what's shown in addition to what's said, we can see that every time Socrates goes out of his house and walks around barefoot around Athens, annoying people over and over and over again, what he comes across are people who kind of make this choice between, I'm confused. You're asking me what is virtue, what is piety, what is whatever. Um, I don't know what it is. I thought I did, and now you ask me a bunch of questions. I realize I don't know. Now the crux is, what do we do there? And then some of the people he comes across, they get really angry, they get really upset, they run away. Some of them get really violent and they respond to Socrates with all these really nasty kinds of attitudes. And others are lean into that confusion and say, yeah, I don't know what's going on, but I want to know, right? I want to know what's going to happen because I'm convinced that there is some way to think about this and I just haven't found it yet. So we look at the way that Socrates' companions respond to him, we start to see different attitudes about reasoning. One of those attitudes is despair. And that we see this especially in Meno. Meno is this guy, Socrates comes to him and talks about the nature of virtue. Meno is really hopped up on rhetoric, and he's been following this guy Gorgias, who's one of the famous rhetoricians of the time. Gorgias is famous for having an answer to anything you want. He can speak as long or as short as you want. He's a know-it-all, right? He's a professional know-it-all, basically. And Meno thinks he has all the answers because he's been listening to Gorgias. That doesn't withstand even a moment's questioning. And instead of saying, okay, I thought I knew something and I don't, he gets violent and he says, well, Socrates, if you think that you're so clever, riddle me this. Uh, how will I go about finding this thing if I don't know it? And if I do know it, why would I ever go looking in the first place? Therefore, learning isn't possible. So what gives?
Hmm.
The question that he asks is called the Meno paradox by scholars, is designed to make Socrates stop in his tracks and think he can't go on. The question is desperate and it wants to make Socrates fall into despair as well.
Yeah, so he's proposing this question, which is a false dichotomy
Mhm.
in a certain sense. Well, maybe not a false dichotomy, but it's you're giving here you can despair, you can never learn anything, and so why
Mhm.
bother? or I already know all this stuff, so why bother?
Mhm, mhm.
And he's ignoring the middle way,
Yeah.
right? And Menno gets, well, he doesn't actually go through with it, right? He just leaves.
He
Uh,
sticks around for a little bit, gotta give him a little credit, but only for a little bit longer, and, Socrates placates him once, and then, yeah, eventually he'll run away. But,
so
yeah.
he fails to see that reason ought to be, or is rather, by nature hopeful,
Mhm,
right? In the face of not knowing, and not knowing how you're going to obtain an answer, and not knowing what the answer might be or where it will come from, do
mhm,
you press on? Right?
mhm,
That's what Socrates and Plato would have us do.
mhm.
But Menno takes the other path. He takes despair, right?
Yeah, why bother?
Hmm.
Or it's not worth
That's
my
the key.
time. Yeah. Or, any manner of response. Maybe the most violent version of this is this guy Callicles in the Plato's dialogue called the Gorgias, where in his case, he basically says, "All right, Socrates, if you are going to pester me with these questions with your useless philosophy, I'm just going to shut up and you're going to have to do the argument yourself." And then Socrates spends, a third of the dialogue talking to himself, like acting out the conversation and trying to model what it would look like to keep searching in the face of not knowing the answer.
Hmm. Awkward.
Yeah.
So in that, towards the end of that section on Menno,
Hmm.
you sort of explain what education is to Plato.
Hmm.
Uh, could you offer some thoughts on that briefly?
Yeah, we can sum it up in two big words for him. One is recollection. This is, this kind of mythical account that Socrates gives a couple different places where I don't actually have to learn anything new because my soul was kind of in communion with all the truth at one point before it came into the bodily form. And then through the trauma of coming into the bodily form, it lost its contact with all those things. But if it looks around at reality and in almost a very sacramental way, if I look at reality and I see it really points beyond itself to some greater, truth that is present in it, then I'll start remembering all that stuff that I was already aware of. So that's the recollection side. The other side, we could say, is the turning of souls. This is we see in the allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic, the most famous passage in all of Plato, where he says education is not like putting sight into blind eyes. It's not fixing, a broken organ or something like that. It's not taking some empty mind and throwing a bunch of stuff in it, which is what we tend to think. We all have seen The Matrix or something. We think if only I could download the contents of
Sure.
Wikipedia, then I would be wise. And Socrates says, nope, that's not what it is. Instead, what it is, it's taking your already functioning organ, the eyes and the metaphor, but the reasoning and it's what he means, and just turning it to look at what's best. And so, what it is to be educated is to direct your soul to the good. You look at Christian authors, that should sound really familiar. Maybe the best example is Julian of Norwich, the 14th century English anchorite, really, awesome writer, mystic, seer, kind of crazy, but really insightful. But she has this passage about like you're on this road, and one side is God, and the other side is just not. And the only thing that matters is your direction. And
Hmm.
that's more or less what Plato's point is too. The education is right directedness.
Okay. Just a few minutes left here.
Mhm,
By way of closing, could you offer your conclusion?
mhm,
And then maybe, so sections 9 and 10 of your essay, 9 is philosophy, reason, and mystery, I
mhm,
think, or something like
mhm.
that.
Something like that.
And then 10 sort of ties it all together. So if you could maybe in just a couple of minutes offer,
Sure.
uh, like, where do we go from here?
Yeah. So the concluding section goes into Plato's Phaedo, which is the dramatization of Socrates' death. And at the very heart of the Phaedo is this encounter with the bigger fear. Everyone's scared of death. They're all worried about that. They think that's the worst thing that can get them. And Socrates says, that's not the worst thing that can get you. The worst thing that can get you is what he calls misology, which is the hatred of logos, the hatred of reason.
Hmm.
And the reason why hatred of reason is worse than even than death is because, death is the loss of your bodily form, but it's not counter your very nature. Whereas to hate reason is to hate yourself at the deepest possible level because you hate your essence
Mm.
and not just your existence. So what do we do about that? Well, that's the real danger, and if that would be the ultimate despair is to fall into that, and that happens, he says, when we think we're getting some progress in reasoning, and it's going well, and then something goes wrong, and everything goes bad, and we lose all of our progress, and then we have this crisis moment where we think, okay, do I give up in despair, or do I get back on the horse and try again? And Socrates' response to this is, you get back on the horse, right? His way of thinking about this is a very important thing he says, which is, don't blame reality for your failure to reason. Think about whether you are reasoning well, actually. And that's exactly the kind of thing that Camus does. He blames reality. He says reality isn't intelligible. And Socrates says, or maybe it is, and you just haven't opened yourself to that intelligibility surprising you in some way that you didn't expect. So that's kind of the point about the Phaedo. And then that opens on to this idea of mystery. And this maybe brings us back to that question about Heidegger and how Heidegger kind of sounds like he's on board with the Catholic view and also kind of doesn't sound like he's on board. And the difference between Heidegger and the Catholic view on this is that for Heidegger, that mystery is remote. It's unfathomable. Whereas for the Catholic view, mystery is kind of paradoxically aligned with intelligibility. We can think about mystery in two ways. One is what I might call a negative conception of mystery, which is, this is mysterious because it's removed from me. I don't understand it. So, there's a mystery. How many people exist outside of the Earth on other planets out in the galaxy or something? I have no idea. It's a mystery. That's a mystery in the sense of, it's the kind of thing we could know. We just haven't found it out. But there's a different sense of mystery that someone like Pieper, following people like Aquinas, offer, which I call positive sense of mystery, which is actually very true to our experience, where there's a sense in which something can be even more mysterious the more you come to understand it. So think of your best friend, your spouse, any loved one, the experience of loving another person. You know that person better than you know anything else, and yet they surprise you over and over and over again. And the more you come to know them, the more you realize there's just more and more and more there to know. So it's a kind of mystery where intelligibility is trying to catch up to the fullness, but the fullness just keeps going and keeps going and keeps going. So in this sense, intelligibility is not actually opposed to mystery, but it's just playing catch up to mystery in this sense. And that's what the Catholic view of mystery looks like. It's, reality is intelligible. We just haven't gotten it. And the more we come to understand it, the more we come to love it, the more it will be available to us, but not by reducing it to our minds, reducing it to our categories, but instead elevating us to it. Which, if we go back to Aquinas on the end of all life, the beatific vision, we can't see God right now. But through grace, we'll be made the kind of thing that can see God as God. So that's an elevation. God's intelligibility is not reduced to our categories. We're brought into what's adequate to God. And so if reason always wants the whole of the truth, and it will never stop doing that, to reason well is to always be open to that elevation, even if you don't know where it's coming from. And that's what I would say in the postscript is, that's what it is to be a Christian philosopher, or any philosopher that has a similar kind of worldview. And I would say a Platonist philosopher has that same kind of, I need to chase after intelligibility wherever it goes and, be open to it surprising me.
That's amazing. That's so beautiful to think that when our Lord made human nature, like when he made Adam, uh, he built into him this. You describe it at one point in your paper as an already and a not yet. Right, so we already have some desire and some drive, and we have some of the resources we need, but we're never actually there this side of heaven.
Yeah.
So, all right. So, in summary, not only faith, not only love, but in fact hope correspond really perfectly, really beautifully to the structure of reason,
Mhm.
our nature as human beings. This has been a real treat for me. We should probably close. Uh, Podcast. I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Yeah,
Uh,
thanks for having me on.
no, absolutely. Maybe there's a part 2 in here somewhere in the future. Let's stay in touch. I just have one final question. What are you sipping on? What are you drinking tonight?
Oh, just a little cab sav.
Oh, Cabernet Sauvignon. Very good. So I actually foolishly I solicited opinions from some of our viewers on what cocktail I should make, and then when I went to make them, I realized I only had gin. So I ended up with the gin martini.
Nice.
Nonetheless, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you enjoyed Dr. Brown's erudition. I hope that you, if you have not yet, you need to go subscribe to Communio. You need to be a part of this conversation. And as we close, until next time, I need to remind you, never give up. Keep on smiling. In memento mori.
Cheers.